gather round, we've got a story to share. Richie and John, they always care. Championing voices, fierce and strong. Tune in, turn up, you can't go wrong. Life and love, they're here to fight. It's Newsday Tuesday, let's take a stand. With Richie and John, let's shake the land. Voices of truth in every sound. In this podcast world, our hope is found.
The Mutual Broadcasting System presents Richie and John, the podcast that connects you with the people, events, headlines, and lifestyle interests of the global LGBTQ+ community. Here's Richie Roy and John McMullen.
Hello, and welcome to Richie and John. We have another episode for you. It is Newsday Tuesday, and boy, do we have a lot of news. I think to start with, we had a Palm Springs meetup recently. It was well attended. It was a really great time. It was for Palm Springs Pride. There was a lot of togetherness and community. The parade was wonderful. We all went our separate ways, and then the world changed.
Little did we know.
Yeah.
Or did we think? I think that's probably the more appropriate way to put it. Because I don't know about you, Richard, but I had a real sense of confidence going into Tuesday's election last week. And I just figured it was a mere formality of getting the vote done, and that while it would be maybe close, I honestly thought that she was going to blow us away, which would have been a really amazing accomplishment when you stop, take a step back, and look at the fact that he's been running for office for 25 years, and she was running for office for just a little over 100 days.
Yeah, I mean, I was leading up to it, I was telling my friends, I was cautiously optimistic. And when I say cautiously, I was like a little cautiously. I was actually kind of thinking about how good the turnout was going to be. Basically, the question was how much of a runaway for Harris it was going to be, was kind of my mental calculus. Watching the kind of dying embers of the Trump campaign, the dwindling crowd sizes, increasingly incoherent, dark remarks. It just felt like a campaign ending on a note of complete collapse and failure, and a sort of messaging that just was not going to resonate.
And runaway racism.
Oh, I mean, rampant, just free-form racism and xenophobia at the end. Yeah. I mean, throughout, but especially right at the end, just appealing to the rankest forms of racism and xenophobia.
And what was really amazing to me was that the changes that we had not anticipated at the polling places happened to be at the hands largely of people who perhaps had the most to lose. And that's what's really painful about this whole process. We've seen it before, and we've been down this road before, and that's the thing I keep trying to encourage friends of mine who have become absolutely apoplectic over this. I had multiple friends who, and I know that this is a very sensitive topic for you and for me, but I have multiple friends who honestly talked about ending their lives after this election. And there is no election that is worth doing that over. All of these things are cyclical, and we've seen it many times over. And I remember feeling that way in 2004 after the re-election of George W. Bush. We'd had 4 years of him. We knew what we were getting. There was no mistaking it. We'd been through a national tragedy with the 9/11 incident, and here we were signing up for the same old mess for 4 more years. And we knew it was going to hit us. But you know what? 4 years later, we did fix that mess. And we made things a lot better with the election of Barack Obama. And it just was not, it was not the disaster that we thought that it was. It definitely affected a lot of people. Millions, tens of millions of people were impacted by the public policy and other legislative decisions that were made during that period, but nothing that couldn't be corrected. And I want to encourage people not to run away from this mess, not to fly off to other countries. I know that I've talked about it myself at times, but that's not how we fix this problem. And by the way, these problems exist in other parts of the world that we don't generally think that they do. They certainly exist right now in parts, various capitals of Europe. And I would hate to be that close to a war that's going on over there in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. There's just a lot of things that you have to take into account. And hopefully we can keep you grounded where you are and get involved with the work that needs to be done for the next 4 years. I heard a really, really great speech this morning online that was put together, and it's up on TikTok, and I know it's been distributed because I saw it on X this morning. But it was Cory Booker, the senator from the state of New Jersey. And I think he said it very succinctly and very emphatically, very emotionally, that we have to stay in the fight. We can't run away from it. So that is my bottom line encouragement to everybody who is listening to us and who's within the sound of our voices.
Yeah. And I think it's especially salient for our community, because this is going to be a difficult time, and it's going to require a lot of solidarity, a lot of attention paying, and a lot of activism. I think our show is going to take a little bit of a different turn. I think that this show there's room for LGBTQ news no matter what. But I think now especially it's going to be a bit more of a voice of the resistance, because we're going into a situation where we have someone in charge who has an autocratic streak to him, who has espoused, who is ensconced in a party that is very virulently anti-LGBTQ. There's going to be a Republican Senate and potentially a Republican House. There's a Republican majority on the Supreme Court. And so there's obviously states where they've been champing at the bit to try to just cause mayhem for our community. So we're really, I think, going to double down on our show in really paying close attention to what is happening at the federal level and the state and local levels going forward for the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I did this morning, and we'll talk about it maybe later on in this program, or maybe depending on how long the episode goes, we might hold it off and save it for one of our future episodes. But one of the things that I asked people to think long and hard about was something based on a historical event, not that far back in our history, but far enough that we have a number of friends who maybe were just wee tots, if they were even alive yet when it happened. In 1992, in the state of Colorado, the people of Colorado, a state that would ultimately turn blue and vote in Barack Obama, that was a place where people were not exactly freedom thinkers either for a long time. And in 1992, they passed a constitutional amendment in that state that was known as Amendment 2. And that made it against the law to afford LGBTQIA plus whoever else wants to join the alphabet, those rights that some people were trying to make part of the law to defend people from being discriminated based upon, that was killed essentially in a constitutional amendment in the state of Colorado. Eventually, a few years later, the United States Supreme Court, including members who were members of the Republican caucus on that Supreme Court panel, voted in a 6-3 decision to toss this thing because it was so unconstitutional as to pick on a select class of citizens and say, no, you cannot have any rights to defend yourself against discrimination. And so one of the things that had happened in between the time that that was heard by the nation's highest court and when it had been passed by the voters was that a major employer in Denver, Colorado was actually one of my competitors. I worked at the time for Aldis Corporation, which was later merged in with Adobe Systems, and we made a software package called PageMaker, which was one of the first desktop publishing software packages. And at the time, our chief competitor was a company down in Denver called Quark. Quark Express was their primary product. And Tim Gill, and you've heard on Richie and my show here in the past, you've heard public service announcements for the Gill Foundation. Well, Tim Gill, who is a openly gay gentleman and was the founder of Quark, Tim had determined that he was going to do his part to try and level the playing field during that period of time. And so as a major employer in Denver, he required all of his vendors to sign a pledge and provide a copy of each of their companies' non-discrimination policies. And anyone who did not include sexual orientation, gender identity in those policies and protect their employees from discrimination and honored their customers who happened to be LGBTQ, well, they were dropped as vendors from Quark. And there's a lot of companies, small companies, that depend on companies the size of his, which was, I think it was roughly a little over 1,000 employees at the time, for doing a lot of business with them, whether it's to buy their thumbtacks or their paper or a lot of other products. That is one way to influence people with the pocketbook. And this morning, I actually reached out to people who follow me on social media, Richie, and I think you know this because you saw my post earlier today. And I asked people to think about who are the people that you do business with? Like, what restaurants do you go to? What stores do you shop from? And I think that if you own a business, you actually have more pull than you think you do. But even if you don't own a business, if you spend your hard-earned dollars at various places, if you're a consumer of people's goods or services, I don't think that there's any problem with saying, I need to know what your policy is with regards to these things and where you stand on this. And even I would go so far, if you suspect, asking people, who did you vote for president? Because if that party or those people that they voted for are people who are fighting your interests, then there's no reason for you to continue to fund them. You can have an impact. And believe me, no small business wants to lose any customer at all. And granted, if they flip the other way, they might lose somebody too. Well, so be it. Then that's who their customer base will be. But as for me, I choose not to go to restaurants that I know that the owners support that kind of thinking. I choose not to go to a hardware store where there's that kind of nonsense. I choose not to go in and to buy my office supplies in a place where people think that way. There's always an alternative. And that is one way that you can have the power of one based on people who are supporting the people who otherwise would have you put in one of those concentration camps that Donald Trump talked about wanting his enemies to be in.
And it's going to require some diligence. You know, a great example, for instance, that I know a lot of small businesses rely on is a company called Uline. Mm-hmm. They sell things like cardboard boxes, packing tape, you know, all the kind of logistical support stuff. They have a really large catalog, and it's all very useful stuff for small business, you know, packing peanuts, whatever. It's all very Trumpy. And the company is run by an arch conservative person, you know, actually couple, and they funded a lot of, you know, sort of these extreme conservative think tanks and races. And it might take some sourcing. It might take some work to find a replacement, but when you're choosing how to spend your money, especially as a small business, but even as a consumer, you have to do a little extra work now. And maybe it might even cost you a little more, or maybe a product that isn't quite as good. But you have to think about your values right now, really more than it's really paramount that you express your values with your wallet. And again, you know, we've talked about it before, do so noisily. Don't just slide into the night. Don't just change vendors. Let them know. And if you see people like Robbie Starbuck targeting a business, you immediately know that there's somebody that you need to target as well from the other point of view. And anybody who caves to him, you need to not support them. Yeah. And make it known that you're not supporting them. Don't just not go. Let them know I've been contemplating buying a whatever, and that will not happen now with you because you support discrimination. You support things that are contrary to my personal interests. So F you. And it really requires, I think, individuals to do that work. As we've talked about on the show before, At the end of the day, the HRC, they don't care about the HRC. They've folded in front of the HRC. They've pulled out of the equality index. The HRC has very little purchase over these people. But what I think does have purchase is millions or hundreds of thousands of individuals. That makes a difference in a way that relying on or hoping that an advocacy group is going to do the work for you isn't going to get there.
I think a lot of us also counted a little too much on the people we thought would have influence. And I think that in our society today, we've given far too much importance to quote unquote influencers, and probably no better case to be made for that than just how much impact Taylor Swift didn't have in this election. I mean, when you consider how many tens of millions of followers and supporters of hers there are, and then you see what happened in this election, I'm not so sure that I buy into the influence of influencers anymore. So the best influencers I've found are those that know your family members the best. And that's you and your cousins and your aunts and uncles and brothers, sisters. We're going to talk about this tonight in terms of we've got an upcoming holiday with Thanksgiving. And of course, the Christmas holiday and Hanukkah and other winter holidays are just around the corner from us. And whether or not you should spend time with people who you know voted against your interests this year. But these are all things I think you have to take into account for your own well-being, for your own mental health. And to make a point to people that you can't love those policies and those people who practice those policies or put them in place and feel like you can love the person who supports that, because it's just a very contrary thing. Believe me, I wish in some ways I had more family that I used to hang out with, who I could hang out with for the holidays, to make the specific point that I'm not going to hang out with them anymore for a reason.
Right.
But in reality, I'm very fortunate because most of the people who are in my family are really cool on the right side of these issues. And we're just as upset about them as I am. So the world will not end. The sun will come out tomorrow somewhere, probably here in Palm Springs, maybe not in the Hudson Valley of New York. But I want you to not walk away from this and give up hope, because it's really, if it is to be, it is up to me. That's the slogan. So we all have to get together and do our part to keep people focused on our moving forward in spite of this setback.
Yeah, and I think that you brought up a good point, which is figure out the balance of attention and advocacy and activism and self-care, because I think in the immediate aftermath of the election results, it was, I think a lot of us retreated, just kind of folded into bed for a few days, and it was hard to even say the words to people, to form thoughts. But you can't be like that forever, and you have to start engaging. But at the same time, if you engage constantly, you can sort of become too wrapped up, and you lose the ability to kind of like have context. So really it's like you've got to strike the balance and figure out, for each person that balance is different, but always, this is going to be a long 4 years, and it's a marathon, and it's going to require us to be vigilant, but also to take care to keep our batteries recharged.
Let me give you another thing to think about. If you get too caught up in being worried that all of this stuff is going to come like down the mountain right away as an avalanche and bowl you over, there are reasons for certain people in this new old administration to be concerned themselves. I work with a number of clients on the podcast front who have a variety of different kinds of programs, including one who does a program on national security, and who was, in fact, a military intelligence officer when he was in the United States Marine Corps. And he appears on a regular basis, almost every day, on one of the Fox News networks. He's not a partisan hack and weirdo, crazy guy like a lot of the people that they have on, but they do bring him on because he can give a clear assessment on what is going on in a whole wide variety of issues that may have anything to do with terrorism on up to, supply chain issues and things like that. And one of the things that he has been pointing out in this past week since the former president was reelected is he's got an interesting problem right now. And it's one that he's going to have to pay attention to. And so I don't know how well he can pay attention to a lot of other things considering this particular problem that he's got to pay attention to. And that is, it comes down to that thing, friend of my enemy is my what? There is a very close relationship between Russia and Iran, very proactively of late, and very much so right now, would like to kill Mr. Trump. They have been trying to assassinate him. And this is something that we as a nation need to be paying attention to. Frankly, I do not want Mr. Trump to be assassinated. And the reason I don't is because I believe that Mr. Vance is far more dangerous at this point in time because I think he's very much in the pocket of the people who want to enact and make things happen from Project 2025 and so on. And he's got a lot more piss and vinegar in him than Trump does. I want to see us get to the end of this 4 years as close as we can without Trump going anywhere except being ineligible to be in office any longer. And for us to really focus on making sure that Mr. Vance never advances to the Oval Office. So you got to be strategic in these things and think them through. But I think that he's going to be somewhat strategic as well. And from what I hear, the woman, and I can't think of her name right off the top of my head, but the woman who is apparently going to be his chief of staff, she has already told him that there's not going to be any BS like there was in 2016, that she does not want this thing to turn into a circus clown car. And while I don't think that anything but that is possible, that is how it needs to be for sure.
It'll be interesting to see who, because this is the question is, Trump is one thing. I mean, he is, but it's who he surrounds himself with. And the problem is so many of the quote adults in the room the first time around have distanced themselves from him because he was a lunatic and a dangerous person and not someone who had American values at heart. And they've pretty much spoken out against him pretty vociferously. He's someone who requires absolute loyalty. So what you're going to end up with is him being surrounded by lickspittles and these sort of glassy-eyed ideologues who are willing to say nothing but, wonderful things to him to get their way, to get Project 2025, to get their little particular piece of special interest done. And so it'll be interesting to see if this chief of staff is this kind of adult in the room. Who else is going to be there?
Yeah, it certainly isn't going to be the likes of, somebody who will have a role in his administration will be Elon Musk. And I'm more concerned about him because his first and foremost priority, of course, is to have government contracts for his space company and for his satellite services as well. And that's what concerns me. And as a foreign national who was given citizenship in this country, I think that Mr. Musk and also our friends from Australia, the Murdoch family, need to have their citizenship stripped before we hand over the keys on January 20th next year. But I think that's a fat chance that that's going to happen. It hurts, but we are going to move on, and we're going to survive, and we're going to fight, and it's not the first time that we've done this. And sometimes you need these things to happen for some of these numbskulls to get the picture, to see exactly what was going to happen. And I think for a lot of us, we knew what was going to happen if Trump won the first time against Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And she was 100% right that he was going to fuck up the Supreme Court like there was no tomorrow. And did he? Yep, he did. He had 3 appointments to that bench. That's unheard of in a single term. And look what's happened. They basically have told him it's okay for you to go out into the middle of Fifth Avenue and fire off your shotgun. Mm-hmm. So now I am really looking forward to seeing. There's no way that he can afford the $80-some million or $1 billion, I think I heard, that it would cost per million people to deport from the United States. But I'd certainly like to see him try to deport as many as he can, because in the process of that, he will undoubtedly end up deporting or trying to deport a lot of people who are legit United States citizens. And a lot of that will be simply because of the color of people's skins or where they go to practice their faith. And when that happens, there's going to be some people who are like, wait, I voted for you. And it's going to fall on deaf ears because they don't look like the kind of people who'd vote for him.
Absolutely. I mean, this is already kind of happening. There's a lot of folks who are finding out after they cast their vote that that things that might hurt them are things that they voted for themselves. When they things like the Republican platform wanting to do things like cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, slashing funding to the states for things like Medicaid, for things like disability, slashing the Department of Education, all these things. They're like, wait, what? But I'm on disability. I'm on Social Security.
Right.
But I voted for him. Well, you didn't pay very good attention. And now I don't know what to tell you.
But he told me he wasn't going to do that. Well, some of us learned the first time around when he was in office. Some of us learned the ultimate truth. And the ultimate truth, my friends, is that when you see Donald John Trump move his lips, he's lying. He's lying. The Washington Post documented more than 30,000 fibs of various degrees during his first 4 years.
Yeah.
30,000 plus.
It's pathological, and it's also just, he's someone who is completely about political about expediency and media coverage. He will say anything if he thinks it gets him what he wants, with no interest in follow through necessarily. The only things that really seem to motivate him are extreme racial animus, xenophobia, sexism, just the basest kind of like crassest elements of human behavior seem to be stuck in his brain. All the policy stuff, he'll say we're going to cut income tax 100% one day. Then the next day it's as if he never said that. And if someone said, well, what about that tax cut? He'll say, what are you talking about? You cannot trust a word out of his mouth. But you can trust the vision that he has. And I think that that's the thing, is that the dark vision that he has in terms of mass deportations, in terms of kind of rolling back any sort of protections for women, LGBTQ folks, people in this country who weren't born here. Stephen Miller, a truly Nazi character, if there ever has been one, was tweeting or truth socialing or wherever it was, that one of the things they're planning on ramping up is a denaturalization process. So people who are actually naturalized citizens who immigrated here are also on the chopping block as far as they're concerned. Because again, it's not about the process, it's about the color of your skin and where you're from.
Yeah. Because you threaten these white losers. I have never felt more. I mean, there have been moments where I've come close, but I have never felt more racial guilt than I do today. I feel gross for being white.
And it's this thing that they have stoked. I mean, in the first administration, getting into bed with people like the Proud Boys, and really about, because why so xenophobic? What's the flip side? Well, white supremacy. And, if you've heard Donald Trump talk about things, he has these crazy ideas about genetics and DNA. He literally has, I wouldn't be surprised if he had one of those skull calipers in his office to make sure that your skull is properly European enough. It's that level of kind of crazy, racist, pro-white, anti-everyone else kind of deep-seated thought that, from all accounts, was something that came directly from his father. I mean, he grew up in a culture of denying people of color housing, despite that being illegal.
Right.
He was raised at the teat of racism.
Well, One thing I was definitely looking forward to was his being sent to Sing Sing, which could still happen next week. He's going to be sentenced next week. And I hope that Judge Juan Marchand throws the book at him. The reality is that he cannot prevent the state justice system in the state of New York from doing what it's going to do, whatever that is. I am hoping that the judge, in light of all of the thumbing his nose at the court that was done during his trial, will not give him a pass because he's been elected to public office. It was reported a year ago or last year, I think just before the trial occurred, or in the past year, that he was eligible to be president even if he was convicted, but he could be serving his time not from an Oval Office, but a rectangular one with bars at one end of it. And to me, that would be interesting to see him doing his work from not the resolute desk, but from the destitute desk. And I can't even imagine. I mean, I can only picture what our history books will read in 100 years from now about this chapter in the American Storybook. And it's a tough thing to stomach right now, but I still think that our best days are ahead, and that when we figure out how to rid ourselves of this problem, and it's not just Trump, it's what I'm more concerned about, and Richie, I imagine you feel similarly, but I'm more concerned about the 70 to 80 million Americans who share his point of view on things, and the fact that we live among so many dirty, rotten motherfuckers. He's just a banner for them.
That's the real reckoning that we're having to grapple with, I think, is not just what the next 4 years will look like in terms of having Trump as president and his policies, but Trumpism and the kind of the warm embrace of these values that are anathema to the American project.
When you were growing up, were you ever, how do I want to put this? Were you ever envious that you didn't get to be part of the Ku Klux Klan?
I was always horrified by stories about anything. One thing I'm really glad about is that at the time, and I hope that this continues because there's a chance it won't, that we learned about the dark parts of our history. We learned about the Ku Klux Klan. We learned about what happened in Nazi Germany. We learned about slavery. We learned about a lot of things that happened in this country and elsewhere that were really stains on this country. One of the things that has he's sort of come out of the gate right away is wanting to rejigger public education at the elementary level to be, quote, patriotic. And so what I'm really scared about is that we have Trumpism, which already seems to have taken hold with a lot of people in this country, and then we're going to have a generation even more ill-informed who don't have any sense of the history of this country, of the negative valences of the things that they are hearing from the president.
Well, I know when I was in grade school was when the miniseries came on TV, the Alex Haley miniseries Roots, and boy, I'll tell you, it made me so sick to my stomach to watch so much of that. I mean, it was almost like torture having to watch that and know that people who looked like me did stuff to people who looked like them like that. And I found that to be one of the boldest, truest learning experiences in my early life, because it was almost too much to grasp how much pain there was for people who were Africans who were brought against their will to America and put into slavery here. And seeing that opened my eyes in such an enormous way, because it was a topic that you knew about it because you'd heard people talk about, but you never could have imagined until it was put in a bold visual sense like that. And I would hate to see that stuff erased from the history lessons that we afford generations going forward to see.
Yeah. But you bring up a good point, which is you watched Roots first of all, it was made available. There was the decision to make this miniseries and air it for good reasons. It was aired, you saw it, and you felt empathy. The thing that I struggle with right now when I think about Trumpism and the people who voted for Trump is the number of people in this country, given what we saw the first time around, given what he said, that seemed to be completely lacking in empathy. Is that unless some ill fate befalls them absolutely directly, 100% square on the nose to them, they can't fathom it happening to anyone else. And I think what we're going to see in if 10% of the economic ideas that that Project 2025 and Trump have espoused happen, if they get any of that through, these people who didn't listen and don't have empathy are going to have to will learn the lesson, because it will be squarely in front of them. And it's unfortunate to me and scary to me that there are so many people who seem to lack basic empathy and can't learn by seeing something bad happening to others and thinking, well, what's that phrase there, but for the grace of God or whatever, that they're immune to empathy. And that's scary to me.
Yeah. Well, as you know, we've spent an enormous amount of time on this program in our short existence talking about trans issues, talking about the problems that exist within our own community in terms of the assholes out there who are the GLB without the T, in terms of what people like Mr. Trump and his ilk think of trans people, and the trans people are taking it in the shorts yet again in light of this past week's events. And I do want to hit a couple of these headlines. We're not going to get through all the stories tonight because we've just needed a place to really kind of, I think, dump our emotions and bringing it home with what we're all feeling. But following Kamala Harris's defeat in the presidential race, Democrats are finding themselves divided over the impact of trans issues on the election outcome. And while inflation and an unpopular president contributed to Harris's loss, some within the party argue that their embrace of transgender rights played a role. God, this really pissed me off when I saw this. Republicans spent $215 million on ads targeting Democrats' stance, framing them as advocates for controversial policies. And despite this, the Democratic National Convention largely avoided the topic with only minimal mentions. Former President Bill Clinton suggested a stronger response from Harris, but the campaign underestimated the ads' influence. One poll indicated that the anti-trans ads shifted the race toward Trump by a 2.7 percentage point margin. Some Democrats, including Representative Seth Moulton, voiced controversy by questioning policies on the trans athletes. Quote, "We try to cancel people rather than having debates," he said. Meanwhile, party leaders urge against blaming trans issues, advocating instead to reinforce coalition values. Out Representative Becca Balint expressed, quote, "We're not going to abandon our support of all Americans," emphasizing that the importance of standing by trans individuals was important. And with the trans sentiment growing, Democrats are called to more clearly articulate their values and address voters' broader concerns while advocating human rights inclusivity. I don't want people in the Democratic Party who aren't smart enough to know this. I don't want to see people using these kinds of things as a wedge issue and throwing blame at a certain class of citizens who are probably the most discriminated against in our entire society to begin with. Fuck you. If that's the way that you think, turn this fucking podcast off now and don't come back. Because if you can't open your mind and open your heart and realize that we're talking about human beings and simply affording them the same thing that you want, which is to be able to live your life the way you want to without having government interference. Fuck you. That's how I feel.
Yeah, the article made me very irritated and actually queasy because it's this rope-a-dope game. The Republicans throw a wedge issue out there like a bomb. The Democrats, have a stance on it, and then people, there's this circular firing squad of different factions of the Democrats saying how they should respond to what the Republicans have basically in bad faith just exploded on everyone. The trans rights and the trans population in this country is a very small one. Is very, very, as you said, there's very endangered by policy, by society, but the outsized amount of sort of just column inches being of these think pieces of people deciding, well, how many rights should we afford trans people? Do trans people really exist? These kind of airy think pieces about people who have been existing in this country forever and who are in grave danger. It's malpractice. It's journalistic malpractice. And it leads to exactly what we're talking about here, this kind of losing democratic, sort of this losing battle where we either stick to our guns and are considered too radical by actually just thinking everyone is human, or seeming cynical, because it is cynical, to basically cut off a part of our coalition for the political expediency of not having to deal with that messaging problem. Yeah. I mean, that's just it's a gross place to be put. And the way that article, and also I was irritated too that it talked about a poll talking about swinging things in 2.7. If we're talking about polls right now and we're giving them any credence, the article is over as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
We learned. I think we didn't learn our lesson the first time. We clearly have not learned it this time either.
Nope.
So yeah, I was just like, what if we're going to be having this high-minded discussion about how we should have sold out the trans community? Give me a break. I agree with you entirely.
No, it really upset me, and we are almost out of time here for this episode. However, I will bring this up because I mentioned it earlier, and that is that queer individuals are advised to set boundaries with Trump-supporting relatives during the holiday season. A Yale University child psychiatrist, Dr. Amanda Calhoun, stated on MSNBC with Joy Reid, quote, "You are under no obligation to spend time with family members who voted against your well-being." Yep. Trump's history of anti-queer rhetoric concerns many prompting debate over personal interactions with Trump voting family, and Dr. Calhoun emphasized the role of mental health in those family dynamics, stating, quote, "If family members vote in ways that threaten your livelihood, it's completely okay to avoid them, and it's important to feel free to set those boundaries." Totally agree. The rise in anti-LGBTQ plus legislation has already negatively affected mental health, and this blows my freaking mind. A study shows that youth suicide attempts increased with anti-trans laws, and that the Trevor Project reported a 700% surge in calls after Trump's win. 700%. And I believe it because I got a couple of them myself. Dr. Calhoun emphasized, quote, "Establishing boundaries during the holidays may be essential for your mental health." So please spend this holiday season with your chosen family or loved ones. Don't worry about anybody else. Mm-hmm. Come up with an excuse or tell them to fuck off or whatever, but don't put yourself in harm's way. Yeah. If you want to come over and have Thanksgiving dinner with me and Richie, if you're east of the Mississippi, you can go to Richie's. If you're west of the Mississippi, come to my place. We'll have you and we'll have fun. But don't throw yourself from the frying pan into the fire. Yeah, don't let yourself be the turkey on the table. Sure. Because really, what you're going to be confronted with is at some point, you're going to see the faces of people who espouse love for you, who voted directly against against your interest and even your sort of dignity and your ability to live. And there's going to be some amount of probably either open or at least subtle gloating that they won. Yeah. And that's going to be even more galling. It's just, don't do it. I mean, at this point, I got 2 scoops full of that in my Raisin Bran this morning, and that was when I finally just said, well, I'm about to be an X of X. I'm done with it. And I am. And Richie, I have 8,000 followers there, not nearly as many as you, but still a lot of people who I communicate with through there. And I'm walking away from it. I put a note up yesterday that said, this is it. This is where I'm going. This is where you'll find me. If you want to follow, great. If you don't, have a great life, but not playing around here anymore. When you watch some of these videos that people have put up with the real crazy shit, not that he's just said, but that he's actually done over the last year or so, and especially in the last few months with Trump, I want nothing to do with Elon Musk in any way, shape, or form. I am so glad I never ended up buying a Tesla, which I had considered for quite a while, because I would be driving it off a cliff without me in it. But it would be going to the insurance company to compensate me for. Yeah. Well, Richie, I hope you have a great week, and we're going to get together again soon and have another interesting conversation, I'm sure. I haven't decided yet who we should actually sit down with our first post-election interview and topic, but something tells me that we'll have something very spicy for everybody come Saturday.
I think so.
Yeah. Now, remember, friends, don't give up. This is a time to get involved. And as you said, Richie, earlier, and I completely wholeheartedly agree. And in fact, on Thursday, I am meeting with a group of people here in Southern California, and we are about to unleash the resistance, the radio resistance, essentially. And if I'm going to put the effort into something, I want to put it into something that's going to be healthy and supportive to our friends who listen and view these podcasts. So I hope you have a great week.
All right, you too. And we'll see you on Saturday.
See you then.
Thank you for joining us on Richie and John. This podcast is a production of the Mutual Broadcasting System and is available at richieandjohn.com, as well as most major podcast portals, including Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify.